Imagine being in a floating hotel room, more luxurious than any palace you've ever seen. Suddenly, a tiny tremor. 240 hours later, you're in the coldest water a human body can withstand. Your organs begin to fail within 15 minutes. Your brain, within 30 in 1912. On the Titanic, your survival wouldn't depend on your strength or intelligence. The brutal truth would depend on your gender and the amount you paid for your ticket. This is the story of how the dream ship became history's most famous nightmare. And even with our current technology, you probably wouldn't have survived. When you think of the Titanic, you probably picture a simple ship that hit an iceberg and sank. But that vision couldn't be further from reality. What sank that April night wasn't just a ship. It was an entire city, a floating world with its own rules, hierarchies, and social systems as rigid as the steel that composed its hull. Built at the Harland Wolff shipyards in Belfast, the Titanic was conceived not only to transport people but to be the pinnacle of social segregation on the high seas. Every detail of its design was meticulously planned to ensure that different social classes rarely encountered each other, except when the less fortunate served the wealthier. In first class, you would find the ultimate in luxury in 1912. Suites cost the equivalent of 83,000 Rui today for a crossing. This absurd price guaranteed access to rooms that rivaled the finest hotels in London or New York, private bathrooms with hot and cold water, beds with feather mattresses, and hand-carved furniture. The grand staircase, the iconic staircase, was the social heart of this exclusive world, crowned by a stunning glass dome that flooded the space with natural light. Imagine John Jacob Astor, the richest man on board, walking through the mahogany and oak-paneled corridors, accompanied by his young, pregnant wife. Its $87 million net worth, over $2 billion in today's dollars, guaranteed access to facilities most passengers didn't even know existed, a heated saltwater pool, a squash room, a Turkish bath, and a gym with electrical equipment and hors d'oeuvre luxuries for the time just a few meters away. But separated by a social chasm, the second class offered comforts rivaling the first class of other ships. Middle-class professionals, teachers, merchants, and tourists enjoyed comfortable cabins, a well-stocked library, and a private promenade deck. Its dining room served 3 substantial meals a day, with menus designed by chefs trained in elite European hotels. But descend a few more levels, through doors that were normally locked, and you entered a completely different world. Third class was packed with over 700 passengers, mostly Italian, Irish, Scandinavian, and Syrian immigrants in search of the American dream. Entire families shared small cabins with bunk beds. Single men slept in communal dormitories. Yet as simple as they were, these accommodations represented a revolutionary advance. On other ships of the time, third-class passengers slept in open spaces, without privacy, often on the same deck as the cargo. On the Titanic, even the poorest were entitled to dine in a common dining room with 3 simple but substantial meals a day. And then there was the invisible world that made it all work. 900 crew members working tirelessly behind the scenes. Stokers stacking coal in infernal furnaces 24 hours a day, consuming 600 tons a day to keep the 29 boilers running, preparing 2,000 sheets daily, cooks producing 6,000 meals a day, a small army serving the passengers' wishes and whims. This rigid social structure was no accident. It was precisely this hierarchical separation, both literal and metaphorical, that would determine who would live and who would die when disaster finally struck. Third class, housed in the depths of the ship, would be closest to the point of impact and furthest from the lifeboats. The labyrinthine corridors, designed to keep the classes separate, would become death traps when the water began to rise. The Titanic was not just a means of transportation, it was a perfect microcosm of Edwardian society, with its rigid class divisions, its ostentatious opulence, and its brutal inequalities. And like that society, the ship was built on an unshakable conviction in its own permanence and invulnerability, a confidence that, as we will see, would be fatally shaken on the night of April 14, 1912. Life aboard this floating world followed precise rhythms, elaborate social rituals that reflected and reinforced these divisions. And it is precisely this daily routine, so far removed from our modern reality, that we need to understand to comprehend the true human drama that would unfold on that fateful night. This floating city was not only physically divided, it operated according to social rhythms and rituals, as precise as the movements of the Swiss watches that first-class passengers wore in their pockets. Life aboard the Titanic was a meticulously rehearsed choreography, with each class following its own musical score. For the 325 first-class passengers, the day began with breakfast, served in their cabins by white-gloved stewards, fresh coffee, eggs cooked exactly as ordered, and bread baked overnight. Afterwards, the men could smoke cigars in the fumoir while discussing business or politics. The women gathered in the tea room for morning correspondence and discreet gossip. Lunch was served at 13 o'clock in the opulent a la carte restaurant, operated by the famous Italian chef Luigi, who had brought a team of 20 European chefs, not to be confused with the first-class dining room. This was a separate establishment, where the wealthiest could pay extra for gourmet dishes served on Baccarat crystal porcelain. In the afternoon, at least one change of clothes was required for 5 o'clock tea, served to the sound of a string orchestra. Women wore elaborate evening dresses, while children appeared briefly, presented by their governesses before returning to their quarters. The most elaborate ritual, however, was dinner. Men were required to wear tailcoats and white ties. Women wore evening gowns with elaborate necklines, elbow-length gloves, and diamond tiaras. Dinner lasted about 2 hours, with 11 courses served, in precise sequence: oysters, soup, fish, a starter, ice cream as a palate cleanser, roast meat, vegetables, dessert, fresh fruit, imported cheeses, and finally, coffee and liquor. Margaret Brown, who would later become known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, wrote in her diary that on a single night her dinner dress was adorned with jewels valued at over $60,000 at the time. That would be equivalent to approximately 1.7 million today. She was no exception. She was the expected standard. Meanwhile, just a few meters below, but separated by a social chasm, the 285 second-class passengers lived a simpler, though still comfortable, routine. Without room service, they ate a communal breakfast at 8 a.m. in the second-class saloon. Their menu offered 6 hot dishes, an abundance by the standards of the time. Their afternoons could be spent in the well-stocked library or participating in organized games on deck. The orchestra occasionally played for them, albeit in a less sophisticated repertoire than that offered in first class. The dinner served at 6 p.m. was only for courses, but still included options like roast lamb and plum pudding. And then there was third class, or stage as it was called. For the more than 700 passengers in the depths of the ship, the daily routine was governed by whistles and rigid schedules. Breakfast at 6:30, oatmeal, porridge, plain bread, tea. Lunch at noon, stew, bread, preserved fruit. Dinner at 6 p.m., more stew, perhaps a piece of meat on Sundays. But even this simplicity represented an unexpected luxury for many. One third-class passenger wrote to relatives that she had never eaten so well in her life in rural Ireland. For many immigrant families, the Titanic's 3 daily meals were more than they were accustomed to eating on land. What made this segregation so effective were the carefully designed physical barriers. The ship had separate corridors, dedicated staircases, and separate entrances for each class. Third-class passengers attempting to access first-class areas could be detained and confined. This wasn't just a matter of privilege. It was literally the law, justified by American immigration regulations requiring immigrants to remain isolated during the voyage. The Sage family, 11 members traveling in third class, shared 2 small, adjoining cabins. Father John Sage had sold his brewery in Cornwall to bring the family to a new life in Canada. On the rare occasions they went up on deck for fresh air, they were escorted by crew members and had specific schedules that didn't overlap with those of first and second class. Meanwhile, Isidor Strauss, owner of the Messrs department store, and his wife Aida occupied a luxury suite that cost the equivalent of 80,000 current rolls for the crossing. Their cabin had a private living room, 2 bedrooms with double beds, rarity a walk-in closet, and a private bathroom with 24-hour hot and cold water, an unimaginable luxury in 1912. In a single day on board, Isidor Strauss probably spent on meals and tips the equivalent of what a third-class family had saved for months to buy their tickets. Inequality was not only accepted, it was celebrated as a natural part of the social order. And despite all these differences, there was one element that united everyone on board: the absolute belief in the ship's safety. From millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim to humble stoker Frederick Barrett, all shared the same conviction. They were aboard the safest ship ever built, a technological marvel that defied the elements themselves. This unquestionable faith in human technology, this certainty that we had finally mastered the sea, would be brutally challenged when the Titanic met its icy adversary in the dark waters of the North Atlantic. But to understand why this confidence was so profound, we need to look more closely at the engineering marvel that was the Titanic and the myths that surrounded it long before it first touched water. This unshakable confidence that united all passengers, from the tycoon to the immigrant, was unfounded. The Titanic was not just a ship, it was the culmination of decades of technological advancement, a floating monument to human ingenuity and the belief that we had finally conquered nature. The numbers alone were impressive: 269 meters long, 3 football fields long, 28 meters wide, 46,000 tons of displacement, 29 enormous boilers feeding engines generating 46,000 horsepower. It was the largest mobile object ever built by humanity to that point. But it wasn't just its size that inspired confidence, it was its revolutionary engineering. The Titanic's hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments, separated by steel doors that could be closed remotely from the bridge with the push of a button. Technologically advanced by 1912 standards, White Star Line's advertising proudly proclaimed that the ship could stay afloat even if 4 of its compartments were flooded simultaneously, something considered virtually impossible. Shipbuilder magazine in 1911 even declared the Titanic virtually unsinkable, a statement that would be distorted in the popular imagination into the fateful, "Not even God could sink this ship." Words no one knows for sure were actually spoken, but which perfectly captured the arrogance of the time. What few passengers knew, and what the engineers conveniently neglected to mention, was the fatal flaw in this seemingly perfect design. The watertight compartments did not extend all the way to the top of the ship. They were like ice cube trays, missing a top. If water rose beyond a certain height in one compartment, it would overflow into the next, creating an unstoppable domino effect, a catastrophic failure disguised as a revolutionary innovation. But perhaps the most glaring example of overconfidence was in plain sight in the lifeboats. The Titanic had only 20 lifeboats, with a total capacity of 178 people. There were 2,208 people on board. The grim math is simple. Even with all the lifeboats completely full, more than half of the passengers and crew would have been doomed. And this wasn't an oversight, it was a conscious decision. The British Board of Trade, responsible for maritime regulations, required ships over 10,000 tons to have only 16 lifeboats. The problem: these regulations had been written in 1894, when the largest ship weighed 10,000 tons. The Titanic, with its 460 to 0 tons, technically complied with absurdly outdated rules. White Star Line could easily have installed 64 lifeboats. There was enough space, but the lifeboats were deemed unnecessary, since the ship was unsinkable. Furthermore, they would have taken up valuable deck space that could have been used for the leisure of first-class passengers. Safety was sacrificed for aesthetics and comfort. Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's chief designer, had originally specified 48 lifeboats, but was persuaded to reduce that number, as he would later confess to a passenger during the final hours of the sinking. "I did everything I could, but they reduced everything for the sake of cost." The most disturbing thing is that the Titanic was not an anomaly. It was the standard of the time, an era characterized by blind faith in technological progress, where appearances often mattered more than safety. A time when the White Star Line's own chairman, Bruce May, pressured the captain to increase speed and break records, even in waters known to harbor icebergs. This paradox: advanced technology combined with obsolete regulations and institutional arrogance created the perfect storm that would seal the fate of the Titanic. A 20th century ship operating under 19th century rules, steered by men with the mindset of an era where nature was seen as something to be mastered, not respected. And it is precisely this mentality that explains why, on the night of April 14, 1912, when the first iceberg warnings began arriving by telegraph, they were treated with an indifference that seems inconceivable today. The safest ship ever built didn't need to slow down or alter its course. After all, what could go wrong? How radio operator Jack Phillips responded to the 6th iceberg warning that day, interrupting the transmission of personal messages from first-class passengers. "Chalice, I'm busy." Words that hours later would come back to haunt him when he himself sent the desperate message, "Come on, let's hurry, danger," before disappearing into the icy waters of the Atlantic. The technology that was supposed to save lives would become the perfect stage for one of the greatest maritime tragedies in history, and it all began on an exceptionally calm and dark, moonless night where the stars shone with an almost supernatural clarity in the North Atlantic sky. That night of April 14th seemed tailor-made for tragedy. The sky was absolutely clear. There was no moon. The ocean was so calm that one passenger described it as a plane of glass. This perfect tranquility, which should have been comforting, was actually a recipe for the perfect disaster. With no waves crashing against the icebergs, there was none of the typical whitecaps that normally alerted lookouts. The absence of a moon meant the icebergs reflected no light, making them virtually invisible until they were dangerously close. And the air was so cold around Primbias that it created a phenomenon known as superior refraction, a mirage that distorts the horizon, making it even more difficult to spot obstacles. Since dawn that day, the Titanic had received no fewer than 7 iceberg warnings, relayed by other ships on the same route. The Coronia, the Baltic, the America, and the Californian all reported icebergs and vast ice fields directly in the Titanic's path. These telegrams were delivered to Captain Smith. Some were even shown to first-class passengers as curiosities, then folded and carelessly placed in their pockets. But the Titanic maintained its top speed of 22 knots, approximately 41 kilometers 26 miles. The ship had never sailed at full speed during the entire voyage, and this would be the perfect opportunity to test its limits. There was commercial pressure to impress the world, to ensure the Titanic reached New York ahead of schedule, guaranteeing headlines. Bruce Ismay, president of White Star Line, on board as a passenger, had made clear his desire to set a new transatlantic crossing record. Passengers reported conversations in which he pressured Captain Smith to light the last boilers, the 4 boilers kept in reserve for emergencies. We don't know if this order was given, but we do know that the Titanic was sailing at high speed through a previously reported iceberg field. Jack Phillips, the chief radio operator, was overloaded with another type of message: personal telegrams from wealthy passengers to friends ashore. At that time, wireless telegraphy was an expensive novelty, a toy for the wealthy. The Markin Company, which employed the operators, encouraged them to prioritize paid messages over safety communications. When the Californian attempted to warn of icebergs directly ahead, Phillips responded irritably, "Goblet, I'm busy." At 11:40 p.m., under a starry sky, Frederick Flitt, the lookout in the Rook's Nest, finally spotted something ahead, a dark silhouette against the even darker horizon. Without binoculars, which had been forgotten in Southampton after a last-minute crew change, he hesitated for precious seconds before ringing the alarm bell 3 times and phoning the iceberg bridge just ahead. First Officer William Murdoch immediately ordered full starboard rudder engines full astern was the correct maneuver, turn left and reverse engines. But on a ship the size of the Titanic, inertia is relentless. It took 37 seconds between sighting and impact, enough time to avoid a head-on collision which would have been far less damaging, but not enough time to completely avoid the iceberg. The impact itself was so subtle that many passengers didn't even notice. Some reported feeling a slight vibration, as if the ship had passed over 1,000 balls of ice. Others described a distant tremor or a dull creak. In first class, where a party was underway at the Parisian cafe, some people joked about grabbing some ice for their drinks. What no one knew was that that distant tremor had just sealed the ship's fate. The iceberg didn't just pierce the hull like a knife, it ripped out rivets and separated steel plates along the right side of the ship, creating a series of narrow openings that stretched for about 100 meters. Modern investigations using sonar and underwater robots revealed that the total damage represented only 1.1 square meters of opening, an area the size of a standard door, but was distributed in such a way as to flood 6 watertight compartments, to more than the ship could hold. At the moment of impact, Thomas Andrews, the chief designer, was in his cabin reviewing blueprints. He felt the tremor and knew instantly something was wrong. While most of the passengers returned to their activities, diners, card games, and conversations, Andrews rushed to inspect the damage. Captain Smith, just 2 days removed from his retirement after 40 years at sea, found Andrews in the damaged area. "How much time do we have?" Smith asked. Andrews's answer was blunt and devastating. "An hour, maybe 2, not a minute more." At that moment, the clock began ticking. The Titanic, the pride of human engineering, now had a death sentence. Water was already pouring in at a rate of 7 tons per second. The forward compartments began to submerge, tilting the ship forward. The watertight doors were closed, but since they didn't reach the top, it was only a matter of time before the water overflowed from one compartment into the next. Meanwhile, most of the passengers remained completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation. In first class, millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim, awakened by the tremor, put on his dressing gown and went up to the deck to see what had happened. Upon returning to his suite, he told his valet, "Go back to bed. The Titanic is strong and resilient." This collective denial lasted for precious minutes. Many refused to put on life jackets when ordered, considering them unnecessary or worse, undignified. Some passengers preferred to stay in their heated cabins rather than brave the frigid air of the open decks. Others simply didn't believe the unsinkable ship could actually be sinking. It wasn't until 0:15:35 minutes after the collision that Captain Smith gave the order that finally turned denial into reality: prepare the lifeboats. For many, this was the moment the truth finally sank in. The dream ship was sinking, and there weren't enough lifeboats. The brutal mathematics that no one had questioned during the ship's planning now became painfully clear. More than half the people on board were doomed before the first lifeboat even touched the water. And so began the true test of character, not just of individuals, but of an entire society. The rules, rituals, and the class divisions that had governed life on board would be maintained even in the face of death. As the icy water rose inexorably through the lower decks, the most pressing question became, who would live and who would die when there was no room for everyone? While the question of who would live and who would die hung silently in the frigid air, Second Officer Charles L. made a decision that would determine the fate of hundreds, women and children. First, this was not just an order, it was the codification of a Victorian ideal, a code of chivalry that many men would carry to their watery graves. The evacuation began amidst surreal calm. There was no immediate panic, no stampede. The very horror of the situation seemed too great to process. Women from first class were gently ushered into the boats, many reluctant to leave their husbands. Some couples parted with formal kisses and handshakes, farewells worthy of ballrooms, not of impending tragedy. Ida Strauss, wife of the Mies owner, refused to enter a lifeboat without her husband Issa. "We lived together for many years. Wherever you go, I go." They were last seen sitting side by side in deck chairs on the deck, hand in hand. As the water rose around them, the first lifeboat, number 7, was launched at 0:45, more than an hour. After the collision, its capacity was 65 people, but it departed with only 28. The officers, fearing that the lifeboats might break under full load, launched them partially empty, a catastrophic error of judgment that would cost hundreds of lives. Meanwhile, 3 decks below, a very different reality unfolded. The third-class passengers, housed in the depths of the ship, were the last to learn of the danger. Many awoke to water, already entering their cabins. When they tried to climb to the upper decks, they found locked gates. These gates were not a cruel, last-minute improvisation. They were an integral part of the ship's design, required by American immigration laws to prevent interclass mixing, supposedly to prevent the spread of disease. The gates that normally kept the poor away from the rich now kept them away from the lifeboats. Jim Farrell, a 21-year-old Irish farmhand, led a group of steerage passengers through labyrinthine corridors, only to find a sailor guarding a ladder, blocking their passage. "Go back and put on your life jackets," the sailor ordered. "There will be lifeboats for everyone." It was a lie, deliberate or born of ignorance. Some steerage families, unaware of the way to the upper decks, wandered through increasingly steep corridors until the water reached them. The Goodwins' father, mother, and 6 children, the youngest, just 18 months old, never made it to the lifeboats. Their bodies were never found. The Sod family, 11 members, made it to the upper deck only to discover that men would not be allowed in the lifeboats, and the women refused to leave their husbands and children. All 11 died. Some officers played the women and children. At first, as women and children only. Officer Murdoch, on the east side, allowed men to board if there were no other women around. Officer Littler, on the port side, was adamant, only women and children, even if it meant launching partially empty lifeboats. At 10 o'clock, the famous collapsible lifeboat C was prepared. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, the one who had pushed for more speed, entered this lifeboat, an act that would forever brand him as a coward. There was room in the lifeboat. He would later defend himself. No women were waiting to board. Technically true, but a defense Edwardian society would never accept. A stark contrast was witnessed in the case of the traveling first class with their 2-year-old daughter Loring and baby Trevor. When the lifeboats began to launch, Nanny Alice took Trevor and boarded without informing his parents. The Allisons, desperately searching for their son, refused to board without him. Laura Allison became the only first-class child to die in the sinking. As the ship continued to sink by the bow, the list made it increasingly difficult to launch. The lifeboats, number 15, nearly fell onto number 13, which was already in the water. Only the passengers' desperate screams alerted the crew, who stopped lowering the lifeboat long ago. Amid the growing chaos, the ship's orchestra, led by violinist Wallace Hartley, continued playing, not Nearer My God to Thee, as popular myth suggests, but likely cheerful waltzes and regimen in an attempt to calm the passengers and prevent panic. These 8 musicians, who could have tried to save their own lives, chose to offer comfort until the end. None survived. By 12:40, the water had reached the forward deck. The last conventional lifeboat, number 4, was launched. Only the 4 collapsible lifeboats remained, 2 of which were swept away when the deck submerged. The class hierarchy that had governed life on board now determined survival chances with precision. Brutal. Of the first-class passengers, 62% survived. Of the second class, 41%. Of the third class, only 25%. Of the crew, only 24%. The numbers tell a clear story. Your social standing literally determined your worth in a life-or-death situation. The most extreme case of this disparity was seen between men and women. Of the women in first class, 97% survived. Of the men in third class, only 16%. The intersection of class and gender created a hierarchy of survival as rigid as the one that had governed the dinners just hours before. Margaret Brown, later nicknamed the unsinkable Molly Brown, took command of her lifeboat when the sailor in charge seemed to lose control. She organized the women to row, distributed their extra coats, and would later argue fiercely to return and rescue survivors in the water, being ignored by the sailor who feared the desperate men might capsize the lifeboat. At 02:05, Captain Smith relieved the crew of their duties with a simple, "Now it's every man for himself." Last command. He would be seen minutes later on the command bridge, stoically waiting for the water that would soon swallow him. Swiss watch physicist and clock manufacturer Edward Bovett recorded the exact moment his watch stopped, to when he jumped into the cold ocean. The Titanic was now inclined at an angle of 45, his stern raised to the starry sky. On the deck of boats, Benjamin Guggenheim and his created Victor Gilho reappeared. They had exchanged their sleeping clothes for full night costumes, coat, white tie, vest. "We dress with our best," Guggenheim told a survivor, "and we are prepared to sink like gentlemen." He asked a message to be handed over to his wife. "Tell him that I did my duty." Father Thomas Bass heard confessions and has acquitted dozen passengers, kneeling in the lift, many of them third-class Catholic immigrants. He refused to offers to embark on boats, preferring to stay with those who could not be saved. As a last boat left the ship condemned, more than 15 people remained on board, clinging to anything they could, knowing they were about to face the deadly hug of the North Atlantic. And then, at 2:15, something happened that no one, not even designer Thomas Andrews, had predicted. Unbearable, overwhelming, Titanic began to break in half. Titanic's sound departing was something the survivors could never describe properly, such as a mountain crumbling, like 1,000 cannons firing simultaneously, such as the roar of a hurricane mixed with the bang of an earthquake. Whatever the comparison, everyone agreed on one thing. It was the most terrible sound they had ever heard. What witnessed was a catastrophic engineering failure when the bow sank, raising the stern to an angle of almost 45th. The weight of 15,000 tons of suspended steel in the air created an unbearable tension. The ship literally folded upon itself, like a forced metal ruler, besides its limit. The break began on the keel, the dorsal spine of the ship propagating up through the hull. Passengers reported seeing the deck opening under his feet, revealing the bowels of the ship. Boilers, pipes, cables, the great staircase, proud of the Titanic, imploded in a glass and wood chaos. When the break reached the still-hot boilers, the cold water created vapor explosions that thrown debris and people through the air. For approximately 10 seconds, what was left of the ship remained almost vertical, his stern, completely erect, against the starry sky as a monument to human arrogance. Charles Jogan, the chief baker, had drunk whiskey to fight the cold, a decision that would paradoxically help in your survival. He walked calmly down the stern, down the side of the ship, as if on a stairs, while the Titanic sank vertically. When the water reached him, he simply took a step to the side, without even wetting his head, was one of the last to leave the ship, and, miraculously, one of the few surviving in the icy waters for almost 2 hours. At 0:12, only 2:40 after the collision, the Titanic disappeared under the waters. The two separate halves descended spiral, the bow-plated bow like a submarine plane for almost 800 meters, the stern imploding under the pressure before reaching the bottom of the ocean. Today they rest at 3,800 meters deep, separated by almost 600 meters away. With the ship missing, more than 15 people have been floating in the colder water than a human body can support. Voyage kept liquid only by salinity. Hypothermia in such cold waters is not the gradual process that many imagine. It is brutal, fast, and relentless. In the first 30 seconds, thermal shock causes a reflection of involuntary inspiration. People panting uncontrollably, often aspiring water, heart frequency fires, blood pressure increases dramatically, creating immediate risk of cardiac arrest. After 2 to 5 minutes, neuromuscular disability begins. The fingers become useless, making it impossible to cling to anything. The arms and legs are rigid, even preventing the most skilled swimmers from moving effectively. Between 5 and 15 minutes, the real hypothermia occurs. Central body temperature drops below 35. Mental confusion sets in. The victims often remove their clothes, a phenomenon called paradoxical fading, due to the illusory sensation of heat caused by terminal peripheral vasodilation. Titanic neurologist Dr. Washington Dodge, who survived in a boat, described that he saw passengers in the water disabling their rescue vests deliberately, as if they were in their own homes preparing to sleep. After 15 to 30 minutes, unconsciousness arrives. The body enters a state of forced hibernation. Breathing and heartbeat diminish until completely stopped. Death, when finally arrives, is silent. But before this end silence came the most terrifying moment of the whole tragedy. More than 1,500 people cluster in the water, created a lever of agony that the survivors in the boats would never forget. It was not a scream, recalled Eva Hart, who was 7 at the time. It was a long, continuous moan that seemed to come from an injured animal. It lasted 20 or 30 minutes, until slowly decreased until finally there was silence. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, the highest rank to survive, found himself in the water, clinging to a detachable boat, with impressive authority. He organized about 30 men to stand on the hungry hull, distributing weight equally, creating a makeshift ferry. If any man tries to climb to save himself, he shouted, "We will all go to the bottom." His leadership saved 30 lives in the safe boats around the sinking ship. Contrasting reactions unfolded. In Boat 14, the 5th official Harold Lowe gathered 5 boats, transferred passengers to release 1, and then, unique among all officers, returned to look for survivors. In contrast, Boat 1, released earlier with only 12 people, capacity 40, remained almost half a mile away. Being Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon, British aristocrats, allegedly convinced the sailors not to return, fearing that the boat be overwhelmed. Later, Sir Cosmo gave each crew member 5 homes, played by many as a bribe to not rescue survivors. The unsubmersible Molly Brown begged the sailor Robert Heightons, commanding her boat, to return. He refused, fearing to be overwhelmed by desperate swimmers. Brown threatened to throw him into the water and almost took control of the boat, but was contained by other women who shared the fear of Hitchens. Meanwhile, just 10 miles away, SS Californian was standing, their engines turned off for the night. Its radio operator had turned off the equipment and gone to sleep only 10 minutes before Titanic reached the iceberg. Captain Stanley Lord was informed about mysterious lights and rockets on the horizon, but concluded that it was just another ship signaling for some fishing boat. At 4:10 a.m., almost 2 hours after the Titanic disappeared, the RMS Carpathia, led by Captain Arthur Rostron, finally arrived at the scene. Rostron had forced his engines to the limit, sailing at full speed through the same field of icebergs, in a desperate race to save lives. When he arrived, he found only scattered savory, boats and bodies floating in his vests. The rescue continued until dawn. The sun revealed a surreal scene. Savior boats spread over kilometers, some still padding toward Kapa, some virtually empty. Gigantic icebergs surrounded the area and floating between them. Dozens of bodies dressed in thin clothes, many still wearing fragile vests in postures of their final agony. On board the Carpathia, survivors tried to sue what they had witnessed. 17-year-old Jack Tier, separated from his parents during evacuation, found that his father had perished while his mother had survived in another boat. He reported later, "I never dreamed that it would be possible for a large ship to sink within hours. No one in the world, I think, would have believed it as possible." Charlotte Collier, traveling in the second class with her husband and 8-year-old daughter, had been placed in a boat while her husband was behind. His last view was calmly waving convests. She later wrote to her mother, "Harvey is gone, but I still have your daughter, and because of her I will try to live. I was spared, but for what?" As Carpathy sailed to New York with 705 survivors, the telegrams began to circulate around the world. White Star Line initially announced, "Titanic sank, all safe," then probably all the saved passengers. Only gradually the truth emerged. More than 15 people had died in the tragedy. Among the dead was practically the entire top of the White Star Line present on the ship. Thomas Andrews, the designer, Captain Smith, all engineers who remained in the machine houses, trying to keep the lights on until the last moment. Bruce, the president who had pressed by speed, survived to face social ostracism for the rest of his life. The brutal reality of inequality was revealed in survival statistics. Of first-class women and children, 98% survived. Third-class women and children, only 42%. Third-class men, a mere 16%. Death, like life in Titanic, had followed strict class lines. When the Carpathy finally attracted in New York on the night of April 18, a multitude of 40,000 people waited silently in the rain. No applause, no celebration, just the silent weight of a tragedy that had touched the whole world. Titanic had departed as a symbol of progress and technological invincibility. He returned as a reminder of human fragility and arrogance that precedes. The fall next tomorrow would bring a new dawn, not only for survivors trying to rebuild their lives, but for a world that was beginning to question their unshakable faith in technological progress and the social order that Titanic had so perfectly encapsulated. While the Carpathy moved in New York, in rain and silence, one could already feel that the world had changed. Titanic wreck was not just a sea tragedy, it was a cultural inflection point. The shockwaves spread far beyond those 705 people who landed that dark night. The impact was so deep that more than a century later we remain obsessed with this story. The answer was immediate and unprecedented. Inquiry commissions were established simultaneously in the United States and Britain. American Senator William Alden Smith led an aggressive investigation, starting just a day after the survivors' arrival. He kept Bruce and Smay practically in custody, preventing him from returning to England until he witnessed the changes in maritime laws were drastic and lasting. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, signed in 1914, established that all ships should have sufficient savory boats for everyone on board, a rule that remains in force to this day. He ordered iceberg patrols in the North Atlantic and demanded that radio stations operate 24 hours a day. Requirements for crew training and abandonment simulations have become mandatory. Every detail of the tragedy was analyzed and responded with legislation. White rockets, which confused nearby ships, as they were not clearly signs of help, were standardized. From then on, only red rockets would mean emergency. The watertight divisions on all passenger ships should extend to the superior, but while these technical changes occurred, something deeper was happening in collective consciousness. Titanic wreck generated its own mythology, with legends and stories that continue to propagate, distorting and sometimes eclipsing historical truth. The history of the mummy curse, that the Titanic carried the sarcophagus from an Egyptian priestess who cursed the ship, began to circulate only weeks after the disaster. There was no mummy on board, but the legend persisted, reflecting the human need to find supernatural meaning in incomprehensible tragedies. Captain Smith, disguised as a sailor to escape a boat or committing suicide with a headshot, contradicts all the witness reports that saw him on the bridge to the end. The story of the Chinese castaway who hid under a blanket and was rejected as a coward when arriving in New York ignores the documented fact that the 6 surviving Chinese crew members were treated with dignity and respect. Perhaps the most powerful myth is that of the orchestra playing Near My God to the while the ship sank, a powerful image perpetuated in movies and books. Survivors report that the orchestra touched to the end, but were probably regret and cheerful waltzes in an attempt to calm passengers. The transformation of this story into a religious hymn reflects our need to find nobility and spiritual meaning in the midst of chaos. Decades passed and Titanic remained lost in the depths, feeding imagination through books and movies. Until, in 1985, the oceanographer Robert Ballard finally located the wreckage. The images of that rustic, covered party hull, formations that look like rust stalactites, brought a new chapter to the Titanic saga. What Ballard and subsequent expeditions discovered was disturbing. The ship was not intact, as many imagined. He was broken into 2 main sections, separated by almost 600 of debris scattered throughout the ocean bottom. The stern, which imploded during sinking, was almost unrecognizable. A metal contorted mass. The bow, more intact, was just like in the movies, sloping on the ocean bed, its cables still hanging. Even more disturbing was the discovery of shoes. Pairs of shoes arranged exactly where bodies had decomposed, leaving only the sturdy leather-like silent markers where people had reached their final rest. Today, Titanic is disappearing again, this time by dissolution. Bacteria that feed on metal are consuming the hull at a rate of approximately 400 kilograms per day. Experts estimate that in 30 to 50 years it will be little recognizable. The deck of the captain has already collapsed. The big staircase has long disappeared. Nature is slowly complaining about the remains of the technological wonder that dared to challenge it. If Titanic navigated today, modern technology would avoid disaster. Almost certainly, radar would have detected the iceberg miles away. GPS would have warned about the proximity of known ice fields. Satellite communications would have guaranteed clear alerts and rescue coordination. Modern steel hooves, more resistant and flexible, would have resisted better on impact. But here is the disturbing question. Do we really learn the Titanic lesson? In 2012, Costa Concordia, a modern cruise ship with all the technology available, sank after its captain made an unauthorized approach to the Italian coast for a greeting, killing 32 people. The desire to impress, to break rules, to feel invulnerable, the same human factors that condemned Titanic remain with us. Titanic remains relevant not only as a historical tragedy, but as a powerful cultural metaphor. When we say something is like rearrangement of Titanic's lounges, we are talking about the futility of small actions in front of inevitable disasters. The expression "the band continues to play" evokes dignity in the face of certain death. In popular culture, fascination remains unshakable. The 1997 James Cameron film raised more than $2 billion and won 11 Oscars. Museums dedicated to Titanic in Belfast, Southampton, and other cities attract millions of visitors annually. Artifacts recovered from the wreckage of porcelain dishes to jewelry are sold by small auctions in auctions. Why do we remain so obsessed with this specific story? More than a century later, perhaps because Titanic is not just a ship that sank. It is a perfect parable about the human condition, our ambition and ingenuity, our arrogance and fragility, our ability for heroism and cowardice, all encapsulated at 2:40 intense drama. And perhaps most importantly, Titanic reminds us that despite all our carefully constructed technological advances and social systems, we remain fundamentally vulnerable to the forces of nature and the whims of destiny. A lesson that in our era of climate change and global pandemics seems more relevant than ever. While Titanic's last survivor, Milvan Dean, who was only 2 months old during the wreck, died in 2009, the story remains alive. Like the headlight of a ghost ship, Titanic continues to warn us of the dangers of our own arrogance, the fragility of our social hierarchies, and the need for humility in the face of the immense and relentless ocean that still covers most of our planet. Titanic's story fascinates us, not only for the drama of tragedy, but for what it reveals about ourselves. At each time we continue to build our own inevitable ships, whether they are technologies, institutions, or certainties that we believe to be unabated. And perhaps this is the true lesson that echoes through the century. Humility is not just a virtue, it is a survival strategy. If this trip through Titanic has aroused your curiosity about how catastrophes transform societies, you will be hypnotized by the story I'm telling. The video that is appearing on your screen now. It is an equally fascinating exploitation of how moments of crisis reveal who we really are. By the way, that thumb up, it works like a savior boat for this channel. It helps us browse the algorithm much better than Titanic sailed the Atlantic. And if you signed up, consider yourself part of the first class of this community. Always the first aboard when we launch new content. Share this video with someone you know who is obsessed with Titanic stories or fascinated by how societies respond to disasters, and tell me in the comments, if you were on Titanic that night, what your survival strategy would have been. The story continues for those who remain on board. And speaking of continuing, that video there on the screen is waiting for you. A journey as fascinating as we have just done together. Until the next exploration for history.